Iowa City, UNESCO City of Literature. And we would like to thank the sponsors and partners that made this event possible: the City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the Iowa City Public Library, Prairie Lights, Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, and Think Iowa City. Support is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts and the Iowa Arts Council, which exists within the Iowa Economic Development Authority. Between events, please be sure to visit the book fair at Merge, which is located at 136 South Dubuque Street. It's right next door to the public library in the Ped Mall. It's by the playground. The vast majority of the book festival events are offered without charge, but they're not free, so please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowациtybookfestival.org and clicking on support. Today we will be hearing from author Josh Cowen. Josh Cowen is professor of education policy at Michigan State University and an author on topics related to education politics, school choice, and culture wars in the United States. In addition to each of the major academic outlets in his research field, his popular writing has appeared in outlets such as The Conversation, the Dallas Morning News, the Detroit Free Press, the Hechinger Report, the Houston Chronicle, the New Republic, the Philadelphia Inquirer, Slate, the Tennessean, the Washington Spectator, and more. He lives in mid-Michigan with his family. His new book is The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Now, please welcome Josh Cowen.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for coming out this morning. I'm still balancing the mic here. So, my wife and I just got in late last night and had the pleasure of walking around a little bit this morning, and seems like a fun place to be, and just really glad to be a part of it this morning and enjoy the weather here. And I didn't realize until we were driving down here, for those of you who are into college football, I switched spots. So I'm up at Michigan State, and we came from East Lansing, and I understand your guys went up there. So we'll see what happens tonight. What I really want to do, so I've been going kind of all over the country on this, on talking about the book and talking about this issue of educational privatization, culture wars, book bans. You've got a lot of banned books in your state, unfortunately, don't you? So I've been trying to go to places where this is really a driving and critical issue. Of course, I think it's a critical issue everywhere, but in some states it's really kind of on the front lines, and that kind of couldn't be more true than here in Iowa. And I talk a little bit about Iowa in the book, talk a little bit about how what's going on in your state sort of is part of this larger long-term national push to do the kinds of things that I write about here, that some of the other authors here have talked about and are going to talk about later. So what I thought I would do is I would read a few pages from the book just to kind of orient you toward what I have to say in general, and then I really would love to have a conversation with the rest of the time, because there's a lot of stuff that's going on. I wish I could tell you that there's, for as many of the Iowa specific and the state specific pieces of all of this stuff, that there's a whole lot of it that really is nationally driven by just a handful of very, very, very wealthy people. And hopefully we can kind of share a little bit together. I can take some things from you, and I can maybe hand you guys some sort of thoughts on this as we move forward together. Does that sound okay? Sound good? Okie doke. So this book, The Privateers, has come out of, I have been spending on and off 20 years thinking about this stuff since I was a young graduate student in 2003, 2004 when this stuff started, and now this has been a long-term plan. And so what I wrote about in the book is kind of the lessons that I learned, how on just kind of the tools of my profession, social science, policy analysis, program evaluation, these voucher schemes like the one that you have here have defunded public schools, they've devastated student learning, and above all, perhaps have discriminated against vulnerable kids and families. And that is the story. Okay, so if you, I hope you buy the book. I hope you buy the book over at Prairie Lights. But even if you don't, or if you do to support them and you don't get to the book, those are the three things that I want to tell you. Vouchers defund public schools. They devastate student learning, and they discriminate against vulnerable kids and families. But there's a little bit more sort of underneath that. So I want to sort of share with you a little bit about that, and then let's chat. Does that sound good? Forgive me, I'm at a point where I do need these readers. So much of the story I have to tell is something like the machinations of one big metaphorical family. There is deep, old money involved. There is a venerated historical patriarch, that's Milton Friedman, who bequeathed the legacy to the clan's elders today. There are uncles who made their billions in oil and gas, and now, as they approach their earthly demise, are spending it to buy permanence for their life's objectives, one of which is school vouchers. There is the rich aunt with her own inherited billions to spend on pet projects and enthusiasms. The facts and results of those works be damned. There are the tentative, largely sympathetic younger siblings who can never quite buy into the family business but never can quite leave it either. And there's a new generation of prodigals, the young hucksters on the make, unrestrained by the norms and values and discipline that even the most aggressive of the older generation stopped short of abandoning. What you will not find in these pages is the story of a grassroots movement. Although the backers of these school voucher schemes have seized on the language of civil rights, choice is the, quote, civil rights issue of our time, they insist, you will find no bridge to Selma. And even among the advocates whose hearts and intentions are known, as it were, only to God, who claim to center the lives of historically marginalized children in their plans and proposals, there is the unescapable reality. And that reality is that vouchers as a, quote, solution to problems associated with income, gender, or especially racial inequality come from anywhere but the communities to whom those activists say they direct their thoughts and prayers. It is as if these foundational inequalities in American life are only worth addressing in this construct when purported solutions come of and by an overwhelmingly white and male intellectual framing. One thing is certain, the case for school vouchers, whether by scholars, writers, lawyers, lobbyists, or billionaire heirs, has always been a deliberate construction. It is the architecture of an assault on public education as a defining American institution. This is no movement. It is rather more a coup, and it has been a right-wing political operation from the start. So I want to kind of tell you how I wrap this thing up, sort of a sneak preview. As a result of all this, any policy recommendation or key takeaway from a book like this must begin with a vigorous commitment to make direct and sustained investments in public education. Every other initiative depends on it. Of course, how we spend that money matters, both in terms of the specific funding sources and in the programs and services that money supports. Other books can and do detail evidence-based spending targets, but my view from a big picture perspective and from the standpoint of motivating renewed interest in these investments is not only in the operation of public education, but for its purpose. And from that vantage point, answers must form around whole child approaches, the idea of schools as communities, and the idea of learning as a lifelong endeavor. Ideas include universal school meals. Have you heard about that recently? Right? That nourish kids throughout the day and alleviate the stigma of poverty. School-based health clinics, not simply for children, but for the adults who serve them. Weighted funding formulas that reflect the true cost of educating diverse learners. Grow your own teacher training programs, drawing on local talent. Early childhood investments alongside after school and summer school programs that recognize education is no longer just 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., Monday through Friday, 180 days a year. Each of these have a much stronger evidence base than school voucher schemes, and each in its own way provides a rationale for public education that affects daily life. And then, because of who and what religious nationalists are attacking, both implicitly and increasingly explicitly, when they speak about, quote, education freedom, there does require a direct defense of public education as a matter of human rights. The marginalization of LGBTQ plus families, reproductive rights, environmental justice, and histories of underserved communities in the United States not only coincides with, but are weapons in the attack on public schools. They are potent because they measure commitments to future generations of Americans who will define their own identities and have their own destinies rather than having their parents and grandparents define their futures for them. Our children are not ourselves. They are with us, the poet cautions, but they do not belong to us. What the rapid erosion of key American institutions, legal precedents, and even the commitment to international peacemaking over the last 20 years have in common are many of the same organizational forces, huge dollar and dark money financial backing, and increasingly radical disengagement from shared civic responsibility. American public schools reflect our social strengths, but also our weaknesses, issues of racial and economic segregation, the inability to fully meet the needs of students with exceptional needs, and the challenges of embracing student populations that enter the building every morning from vastly different home experiences. Those will remain problems in American education as long as they remain problems in American life. The fundamental threat to democracy posed by religious nationalism, whether in our schools or in our communities writ large, is not religious per se. It is what comes from that form of religious radicalism, in the case of U.S. education, a dangerous and domestic form of isolationism, oriented toward a notion of every child and every family outside of a church sanctuary left to fend for themselves. That is the policy reality of fully realized Friedmanism at its core, and those are the parental values stressed in the modern school voucher movement. Betsy DeVos is on record lamenting that public schools, in her view, displaced churches as centers of community, and for her belief that school choice will reverse that trend. She wants to advance God's kingdom through these voucher schemes. So any recommendation away from that view that I might have in the language of policy analysis or any tenet in the language of civic values would start with an unconditional rejection of the reckless disregard held by Christian nationalists for children who do not look or love or pray the way they do. It would be based on the reality that rigorous evidence from political science, economics, sociology, and educational thought strongly points away from school vouchers entirely and from much of school choice policymaking more broadly as anything resembling a comprehensive solution to the problems still entrenched in American education. Such a recommendation would itself become a moral statement, one that acknowledges the sins of our own parents, reckons with the limits of our own mercy today, and demands a future of grace for all children. So that's what the book's about. And that's what this conversation's about. That's what this fight is about in state legislatures and in communities all over the country, including here in Iowa. So what I'd like to do is just turn it over to all of you, and let's continue to talk about this for the time we have remaining, if that works. So I'm kind of move over here because I was saying earlier, I am a professor by day, and the lectern is only partially comfortable for me. So
yes.
Please do.
Okay.
And I believe this is supposed to be on. Can you guys hear me? We good? All right.
My name's Casey Skippers, and I just want to start by introducing myself. I'm a founding board member for Annie's Foundation.
Oh, great. Thank you.
And we started a couple of years ago. We're 6 moms in the Johnston School District, and we came together to fight book banners in our school district. So we raise donations, and we buy banned and challenged books, and we give them away, and that's why I'm here today.
Thank you.
So we're at the book fair. Come see us. But I just wanted to point out that there was a recent story in the Iowa Starting Line newspaper that there were 144 kids from the Johnston School District who pulled out and took vouchers and went to private schools, and 163, I think, from Urbandale. So that pulled $1.1 million from Johnston schools and $1.2 million from Urbandale schools. And I also know, I read recently that private schools have a 45% failure rate.
Yes. That number might have come from some of the stuff I was putting out there. So across states like Iowa, so 69% of Iowa kids using vouchers were already in Iowa private schools. The remaining 31 are coming from districts like those you're describing. And in an individual district basis, that can be devastating. Statewide, I think it's important to know that most of those voucher users are already in private school because it gives a bit of a lie to this kind of marketing around education, freedom, opportunity, hope, whatever gets thrown in these languages. Vouchers defund schools a couple of ways. One, by giving taxpayer obligations to private school tuition where just a year before or a year earlier they were borne by the private sector. So those are all of a sudden huge new impacts the budget has to deal with in the states. And the other way is exactly what you're describing, is kids leaving these districts. About 25 to 30% of kids who leave public schools to go to a private school go back to their public school within a year or two. I call vouchers the education equivalent of predatory lending. The reason that those kids leave is they maybe haven't been always perfectly well served in their community schools, usually because those schools haven't been invested in over the long term. Sometimes because they're human institutions and they come up short. And so it's important to know, though, that and this is sort of what I'm trying to get at, these voucher schemes don't solve any of those problems, but they do market themselves very well. And they put pamphlets in parents' hands, and they put billboards out, and they go to church fairs, and they say, you've been failed, come with us. They don't want any checking on any of that. They don't want accountability. They don't want, they will not be on the hook. They will promise you. We see this a lot in other states right now. If your kid might have a learning need, the schools want the dollars, so they'll pull it in. They'll pull kids in. They don't want to be on the hook for IEPs. They don't want to be on the hook for contracts, and we see extraordinary turnover for that reason alone. Just kids come in, their parents are trying something new, and within months they realize it was even worse, and the school is just not living up to its promises. And it's a real problem. I do want to come back to book bans, though, in a second, because all of this, I mean, one of the things probably the most common question I get from media these days, well, Josh, why school vouchers? Isn't it true that the teacher unions, overplayed their hand and during COVID and have destroyed public schools and it's a war between teachers and parents? Isn't that why we're having conversations all over the country, why 24 states have passed or expanded voucher schemes since 2021, including here in Iowa? Isn't that what's happening? No. The answer is the same answer to the question, why are we having more book bans now? Why are we having all of these conversations about where kids go to bathrooms now in public schools? Or whether or not they learn that slavery was bad? That's why we're having these conversations all at the same exact time. They're driven by the same people and they're coming from the same places. Thanks for your...
Hi, so I'm a teacher, and I know that at least in Iowa City, and I'm sure in other places around Iowa, a lot of times the idea is that students with special needs that go to private schools, they're not these private schools are not necessarily required to have teachers that are especially licensed or given specific training. I think a lot of people don't know that when students have IEPs and they are required to receive specially designed instruction in those minutes, when those minutes cannot be met by the private school, they pull in the public schools as an extra help for those students. So even though those students, we might get a minor amount of funds for that, the majority of the work and the hard work that these students need is falling still on the public schools, and specifically because they're not required to have especially robust special education programs or English language programs for students. So a lot of times, even though these vouchers are pulling, and the idea is that they're giving students maybe in marginalized groups more access to what's considered a better education, the public schools are still doing a majority of the work for these students and not receiving the full benefits.
And that's really under the best case scenario, unfortunately. So one of the things, the biggest lie behind all of this stuff is that these vouchers just give parents a coupon to go make, the phrase is to choose the school that best fits their child's needs. And the biggest lie is that none of that's actually true. It's the schools that do the choosing. With vouchers, it's the school's choice, not school choice for kids and families. And the best estimates that I've seen is that about half as many diverse academic learners, kids with special needs, are in private schools using vouchers as are in public schools. At the absolute max, it's about a half. So in most states, about 20% or so of kids have some type of learning need, either fully diagnosed or partially diagnosed, and at most maybe 10% in the voucher schools. And I think that even that's a high end. What the schools are learning to do, so you guys, I believe we're in the second academic year for the voucher schemes here. So once 4 or 5 years come in, one of the things these private schools learn to do, in addition to raise tuition as soon as the vouchers turn on the dollars, which you saw here right away, they learn how to avoid scrutiny from both press, and to the extent there's any sort of oversight at the state level, which there's not anymore, but they do a lot of admitting on the front end. And then where the discrimination comes, where the no room at the end comes, where the it's not working out comes, is in the weeks and months that follow. And that's one of the reasons you see these kids exiting out, because there's just not nearly as much oversight. And this is true with public schools too, by the way. There's not nearly as much oversight on who's leaving and who's moving around as the front end question. So you do get a lot of admissions up front of kids with special needs, kids, by the way, older kids who might identify as LGBTQ, kids from different structured family backgrounds. A lot of that looks kind of okay and evened out at front, and actually they have really enormous turnover rates. And I believe here in this state, in some states, the voucher payments are quarterly or monthly to the schools, so there's at least some monetary incentive for the schools to keep kids as long as possible. In this state, it's a lump sum payment up front, and the school hangs on to those dollars for the rest of the school year until there's a re-verification process for enrollment over the summer. And so there's absolutely no incentive whatsoever for the schools to keep those kiddos. I saw some.
So I grew up in St. Joseph, Michigan.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if you know where that
Sure.
is.
Yeah, of course.
Right about 1990 or so, I was taking AP economics class at St. Joe High School. And I realize it now, didn't at the time, but my teacher then was very much a libertarian type of guy.
Okay.
But I remember, and I don't know why this stuck with me, but I remember lessons in that class talking about using economic theory to make schools better, right?
Yeah.
But back then, it was all about school choice was within the public school system.
Yeah.
So the whole idea was you would be able to pick which high school you went to within your state or within your district. The dollars would follow you to whichever elementary school you went to, and the theory was that all this competition would make each school want to be better and get those dollars. So is that kind of where this all started, and how's it evolved from there?
So, good question. So, a couple things packed in here. So, there are a couple big, the sort of billionaires pushing these things, and they have been pushing them since even well before 1990, but kind of come in two forms. So, there's the Christian nationalist types, the Betsy DeVosses of the world, who, when they're not out there talking about vouchers, they're worried about bathrooms and things like that. And then there's and making sure kids stay in lifelong student debt. That's the other issue that comes up from those folks for whatever reason. The other group are more affiliated with the Koch people, the Charles Koch industry, the oil and gas billionaires that I mentioned at the top. And they're not quite as well covered, I think, in kind of national media coverage about vouchers and some of these schemes. But what they really think, they think public schools are just government in communities. And they don't like government because they like to burn holes in the ozone layer. And they don't, or whatever, right? And they don't like what they call regulation. And they see public schools as one way of regulating. This is why you see Project 2025, first 3 paragraphs of the education chapter in Project 2025. The first paragraph is get rid of the U.S. Department of Ed, the most important anti-discrimination authority in the country when it comes to kids. And the second 2 paragraphs after that are about school vouchers. What all those things have in common is they don't want government in a space worrying about kids and families. The competition piece comes in. So in Michigan, as in Iowa, before the voucher scheme passed here, there already is public school choice. 1 in 4 kids in Michigan, we do not have vouchers paying for private K-12 tuition, but 1 in 4 kids in Michigan are enrolled in a public school that's outside their neighborhood residence, either through an interdistrict choice program or through our state's vast charter school program. Charters are a little different. They're public schools managed independently outside of districts. So this libertarian thing, Milton Friedman was a conservative economist based at the University of Chicago. When he was 43 years old in 1955, Friedman came up with this idea of vouchers for the first time. And he basically said that parents should have the right to kind of direct their kids' education. If we give everybody, in his view, government shouldn't be involved at all. The essay was called The Role of Government in Education. In his view, the long game, government shouldn't be involved at all, including on vouchers. But he saw vouchers as kind of a stepping stone to no schools funded by the states. A lot of that's just what I call an intellectual cover story, because something else was happening in 1955. It was just a few months after something called Brown versus Board of Education. And Friedman knew this, and in sort of archival work that we've gotten since, there was a back and forth between Friedman and his editor on this specific issue. His editor saying, you can't go out there and talk about this voucher thing right after Brown v. Board. People are going to say, correctly as it turned out, that segregationists will want to use vouchers, your voucher idea, to avoid racial integration. And Friedman sort of basically said, what of it? And so you did see early forms of school voucher systems as a response directly to Brown. The idea being giving parents a coupon and then they could go out and self-segregate if they wanted to. And Friedman endorsed that explicitly in his text. Parents could go to what he called an all-white school, or what he called a colored school, or what he called a mixed-race school. As long as parents were choosing, it didn't matter what the result was. Does that sound familiar today? Yeah, doesn't it? So this is just an update at this point. Last thing on this competition, then I want to get to more questions. So competition, so if you're thinking about things in terms of social science, the only spot, I have 8 things to know about, I sort of have 8 summaries about what data say about vouchers and up front before I get into the history of this stuff. And of those 8, only one of them has anything resembling a silver lining or an update. And then one of those things is that when you do introduce some form of mild competition into the public school system, from time to time, at least as measured by test scores, you do see some of those test scores tick up. But the catch of this is, when it's voucher-induced competition, those results are only found in historically marginalized and under-resourced communities, the communities that stand to lose the most money from voucher schemes in the first place. And so when these bills get debated in legislatures, get rammed through in legislatures like yours, they know that the question of defunding public schools, which vouchers absolutely do, is a political problem for them. And so what they'll do is they'll spend a lot of time saying, on the one hand, vouchers won't defund your Iowa public schools, and on the left hand, they'll say vouchers will cause competition to increase a rising tide will lift all boats, they say. Both of those things can't be true. They either will not defund the public schools, or they will not have a competitive effect. But this is something that I kind of say at the end of this, right? I think it's really important to reflect that those competitive effects are only found in those historically under-resourced communities, and effectively communities that stand to lose even more money than they've already lost by historical disinvestment from them. And at the end of the day, I think for folks who want to oppose these voucher schemes, who want to stand up for public schools, who want to oppose book banning, who want to say we need to be more inclusive in how we treat community spaces, I think we do need to at some point talk not just about the evidence, but talk about what's right and what's wrong. And so in those terms, when it gets to competitive effects, what I say is I decline to accept the idea that pitting vulnerable communities against each other for scarce resources is moral public policy. And that's my answer to the competitive effect thing. What a libertarian economist writing in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education has to say be damned. At some point, we need to talk about what's right and wrong too, and not shy away from that conversation.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Allison, and I work at a top 100 high school in Cedar Rapids that has a fabulous special ed program. I think the teacher back there said a lot of parents, maybe I misheard, that a lot of parents want to use vouchers to provide special training and so forth for special ed children. Anyway, I'm here to say
Thank you
that
for your work.
the public schools do have great programs.
Yeah.
But we need to start funding public ed at the appropriate level. Like in Cedar Rapids, they tried to get bonds passed for years, and just recently one finally passed, so the buildings can be spiffed up and to code and attract parents and so forth. But I taught for 25 years in California, and just as I was leaving, they were passing these vouchers and starting pop-up alternative schools. But what I thought I heard there was it kind of crashed and burned recently because these small pop-up schools, so to speak, didn't have the funds to attract top-tier teachers, and if there were high schools, they didn't have money for labs and special facilities and so on and so forth. So am I wrong that some schools have tried vouchers and they didn't work?
So those of you who've been in education or still in education, thank you for the work you do. It's hard to run a school, right? It costs money to run a school, public or private, and there are a lot of great private schools out there. The problem is, and it gets back to something I said a second ago, in general, it's not those elite private schools or those really well-intentioned schools that are well-run and have been in place for a long time serving communities that take vouchers. It is the pop-up schools. It is a set of financially distressed schools that often close anyway. 40% of schools in Wisconsin, where I did a lot of my work, just not that far from here, that have taken voucher payments have closed over time. Betsy DeVos's 501c4 voucher advocacy organization is running a sort of a side campaign called Save Our Catholic Schools. I mean, they are walking right up to the line of saying the whole point of this stuff is to bail out these financially distressed private schools. The reason these schools are financially distressed is, number one, it's hard to run a school, it's expensive to run a school, and in some cases they're financially distressed because the market responded and said this school isn't any good. I'm not somebody that celebrates school closure, whether it's public, private, charter, whatever. I think it's actually generally bad. We know across a variety of other sort of metrics when we're dealing with, say, housing insecure children, kids from migrant communities, kids who might be refugees. One of the first things that sort of the grant funding, the investments the federal government makes in those kids, they want to make sure the kids are staying in a school, just a school. I mean, short of something like an abusive or some awful situation, just stay in the school to give some grounding for the child before we kind of think about this market stuff or anything like that. So school closures are incredibly disruptive, public, private, charter, whatever. But when you're using some on their own terms, these things fail. They have high closure rates. They have horrific test scores. They can't respond to market competition without bailouts from the federal government or from states. It's hard to run a school. It's expensive to run a school. Public schools have generally been, across the board, even in well-funded states, underfunded with respect to the actual cost of educating children and educating diverse learners in particular. I don't find it a flex that some of the voucher advocates, including those in your state, kind of go running around talking about how they can educate children on the cheap. They say that as if that's a good thing. Yeah, I mean, they're just lying too, to be honest with you. I mean, because they want more and more money. When they want these they want more and more spending. They just don't want it to go to public schools. They want it to go increasingly to schools. 90% of private schools, by the way, are run out of churches. And I'm not, like I said in the book, I'm not here to beat up on churches or religious. I'm a religious man myself, singing a church choir. But there's a difference between saying that the church should get bailed out by taxpayers when we've got public schools and other priorities. In Arizona, this is blowing a hole across the state budget, not just in public schools. State had to borrow against its opioid settlement to meet its corrections budget because there's a $1.1 billion hole in the state budget due to vouchers for the vast majority of kids who are already in private school to begin with. That's what's going on, and that's unfortunately the kind of things we're going to have to talk about in this state and other states. Isn't just what it's costing public schools, but what it's costing other community investments as well. Yep. Oh, sorry.
Hey,
I'm not running the mic. Next.
I guess I have the mic.
Yeah.
You mentioned teachers' unions in passing, and I just wanted to ask a follow-up question connected to that. I mean, I know as you do such a good job of documenting, the path to imposing vouchers in each state where it's happened has been a little bit different. In our state, of course, like the prelude to it included destabilizing our public ed system with years of defunding, but also 7 years ago, really diminishing the collective bargaining rights of what historically has been a strong teachers' unions across our states. And thank God for our teachers' union, they've been very resilient and continue to be one of our primary advocates for holding up the value of our public education system. But I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between those attacks in states that have had the strong collective bargaining rights in place for teachers, and also the role of teachers' unions in fighting back right now.
Yeah. So, great question. So, one of the more privileged things that I suppose I can do at this point is get into fights with people publicly, verbal fights about some of these kinds of things and what passes for theory, what passes for some sort of intellectual rigor, what passes for a philosophy worth taking seriously, and what's just bullshit. Not to put too fine a point on it. And one of those things is this idea, sort of one of those things that's just the crap of it all, is all of the extra syllabolic words, all of the long sentences, all of the ideas, all of the posters on dorm room walls for college Republicans, of Milton Friedman and so on and so forth, saying we need libertarianism, we need no unions, we need no regulation, we need all of these things. There's an intellectual pretense to rigor there, and the reason I'm answering the question this way is there are theories and treatises and philosophies and things behind what Betsy DeVos is trying to do, and there are theories and treatises and intellectual rigor and all kinds of things and Nobel Prizes. Right, Milton Friedman won a Nobel Prize. It came right after he was advising the Pinochet regime in Chile. Okay, that's who we're borrowing public policy from when we're okay. But there are theories. But the through line between this kind of education industry, the libertarianism of a Charles Koch, and the Christian nationalism of a Betsy DeVos isn't anything more intellectual or intelligent than just deep hostility to labor unions. And so with all this high-minded stuff that I do think is important to engage in, I wrote a whole book about it. The word Harvard is in the publisher's title. But I think a lot of that, we have to just kind of reduce things to what they actually are. I was at a conference recently speaking to a group founded by Nicole Hannah-Jones from the 1619 Project. And Nicole, when she introduced me and the rest of the speakers, she said, it's important in this world that is being increasingly dominated by oligarchy to call the thing the thing. And one of the things that vouchers are, in addition to just being a long-term Christian nationalist push to bail out private schools, is just an anti-labor movement. And it really isn't any more complicated than that, unfortunately, you know? And there are, listen, I can't stand up for every single thing that every public school has ever did. Sometimes when I speak to public school groups, somebody tells a heartbreaking story about a way the public school has let them down, or a way a local union stood up for someone that maybe didn't quite deserve some sticking up for. That's not the argument. The argument is, in general, what are the best ways that we can kind of come together to solve some of these problems that are in the public school system, that are part of the teaching profession, that are part of the needs that communities have to take care of their most vulnerable kids. And on balance, right now, there's no extra billionaire fighting vouchers. There's no, there's no sort of dark money network of financiers like an Elon Musk standing up for public schools. There are teachers' unions. There are a handful of community groups. I have found, and here's the thing, vouchers have never survived a statewide ballot vote. Did you know that? Never. When put to, there are 3 on the ballot right now this election, Kentucky, Colorado, and Nebraska. And so we don't have, folks who oppose these schemes don't have the billionaires behind them. I mean, there's 1 or 2. I don't know how Mark Cuban feels about vouchers, but it's the teachers' unions, but more importantly, it's voters, and it's actual parents, not those who want to create what I call a new form of religious separatism in this country through a voucher system, but folks who actually do want to invest in schools and communities, and those certainly labor is an important part of that pushback. But at the end of the day, they've got 1,000 things that they're dealing with too. At the end of the day, the biggest defense against these things are voters who time and time again have rejected these schemes. It's why you need the DeVos folks. It's why Betsy DeVos spent all this money in your election cycle a couple of years ago to primary out a bunch of rural Republicans, of all people. It isn't just woke Democrats or whatever they want to paint it as. It isn't just Randy Weingarten that don't like these things. Historically, rural Republicans have been opposed to them too, for the simple fact that there aren't any private schools in their communities. And they believe in their public schools, perhaps for slightly different reasons, but they believe in them too. And it's been those specific folks who've been primaried out by these dark money schemes the last couple of years.
Why are the Koch brothers and dark money so intent on keeping school vouchers? Is it to keep social status layers in place and some of the things that Donald Trump talks about? What is their purpose and agenda?
You know, with the Koch industry folks in particular, it really does come down to trying to get rid of all forms, as they see it, of government. And Koch, Charles Koch's son, famously in an interview said they had to read Milton Friedman around the family dinner table, and it's not clear whether he was speaking facetiously or not, but he was sort of saying so entrenched with Friedmanism and this libertarian economic thought was his family, right? So some of this just comes down to this ideology. There's a lot of writing right now, and I can't sort of take it on, especially in a limited time setting like this, but there's a lot of writing right now about kind of this appeal, this new appeal of kind of the libertarianism to certain voters this cycle in particular. And a lot of that comes down to this idea that, like, all of us can be self-made if only we put our effort in, or all of, I think that there's real belief from, up to the very top in Koch world about that. And that's why they think vouchers are such a great solution. Instead of investing in public schools, which is just more government, let's just, again, give everybody a coupon and let them go figure it out for themselves. But again, that's not how it actually works. It isn't about parents going to schools. It's parents going to schools, and if you don't look like or love like or pray like the school wants you to, there's no room at the inn for you or your child. And that's just a complete, I don't even know that it's a weakness of the theory. It's just a false promise. And these folks don't seem to engage in that, either because they don't want to or they just don't care to know how things actually work on the ground because it sounds good in theory. And it really isn't any more complicated than that, or in very basic terms, as I said just a second ago. I mean, a lot of this comes down to just really hating unions. And you really can't overstate how much this is about that, too, especially for the Koch people. Like in the back there more? Or I'll let you.
In some of the other states that have had vouchers for longer, have you seen any efforts to have strong government oversight on a way to a full repeal of vouchers?
So only Illinois has fully repealed a voucher system so far. Once these things get put in place, they're hard to pull back. But a lot of folks have tried. So in the old days, when I first started working on this as a young researcher and policy analyst, so sure were all of these people I talked about that these voucher schemes were going to work, that they were almost falling all over themselves to put data out there, to put out evaluation, transparency, accountability. The big voucher systems really started to grow right at the same time as No Child Left Behind came online. If you know about that, it's the old George Bush-led sort of school accountability, school report cards, testing used to evaluate public schools and so on. And at that time, voucher advocates were sort of very much part of that network too, and were perfectly fine with the idea that private schools had to basically more or less follow kind of the same rough testing and reporting guidelines as the public school. And then the results came in. I didn't say a lot of this because I say it a lot in other public spaces and I say it a lot in the book, but over the last decade, the bigger and the more recent the voucher scheme, the worse the results have been when we've had the data to ask about those results. And so you've seen headlines from the New York Times on down. Dismal results surprise researchers as DeVos era begins. Student test scores fall for years in the largest voucher system in the country. Louisiana's voucher program sends parents to D and F private schools. You have to, and listen, I'm not here to shill for testing and test scores and things, but the plain reality of the fact is that right now that is the way that public schools are evaluated. So my simple point is, if that's how you're going to evaluate public schools, if you're going to take public dollars, the public checks on you, and that includes voucher schools, vouchers should have to follow the same testing and reporting requirements, and when they do, the results are horrific. And sometimes I think the debate about test scores masks just how bad that is, because the other side will come in there and say, Josh, but parents are happier. Don't worry about just slight differences in test scores. No, we're not talking about slight differences in test scores. You have to go to something like what Hurricane Katrina did to test scores for kids in Louisiana, in Louisiana's voucher program, or something like what COVID-19 did to test scores more recently, to get at the magnitude of the learning loss measured by test scores for voucher children who move from public to private school. And the reason, I write about this in the book, and the reason for that is what we've talked about in several responses so far today, which is that most of these private schools, and especially the ones that have room in them, they're not any good. They are these subprime schools, these pop-up schools, these schools that are about to close perhaps. It's hard to run a school. And they're not particularly great at it, and they were going to close until the government came and bailed them out with the voucher. And the results show that. And so what I'm taking a long time to say, but trying to kind of cram a couple of extra responses in, is that since those horrific results over the last decade, all of the new voucher legislation has stepped way back from any kind of accountability mechanism. You're lucky if you get a requirement that the schools have to test at all, or report their graduation rates, or report their open their financial books. In Arizona, Governor Hobbs, Democrat, narrowly elected in 2022 after following a huge voucher advocate as governor who signed a massive, massive bill in that state. But she still has a supermajority to deal with of Republicans there, voucher supporters. She proposed a 6-point plan in January for accountability and reining in this voucher system. And it hit on most of those things I just said. Opening your financial books, make sure you're not just defrauding taxpayers and parents. Some modicum of testing, so at least we know that you're doing something like what you're promising parents. Testing and accountability in the voucher space is a pro-parent policy. One of the things that she also proposed was background checks and fingerprinting for teachers in voucher-funded private schools. And you know what these people said? They said that that's too much regulation. So I'm not optimistic, unfortunately. If we're in a world where background checking teachers in voucher schools, overwhelmingly, by the way, run out of churches and church basements, if we're in a world where that's too much transparency and that's too much oversight, It's going to be a long time, unfortunately, in some of these places that we're going to be able to walk up to and have an argument about maybe checking on academic quality or checking on some of the other things that's happening inside those buildings, unfortunately. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and I just wrote a whole brief about this that was a couple of weeks ago, but it's going to be an uphill battle if you're dealing with people who think that we shouldn't even wonder because it's too much government regulation of those church schools. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I'm screwing this whole thing up, and I apologize. I'm going to follow the mic.
You kind of led into it, but
Yeah.
I'm just curious in your view, kind of what does this look like 15, 20, 25 years down the line? I mean, usually if you have a policy that schools are opening and kids are only staying there a year or two and
Yeah.
then they're finding it doesn't work for them, they're going back to public schools. Schools are opening, schools are failing, they're closing. You know, increasingly, schools don't want to open in that environment, right? Kids don't want to go to schools in that environment. But is that the logical end of this? Is that it kind of kills itself, or do they keep innovating to keep this thing alive?
I have to believe, certainly on the social science piece, and certainly in reflecting on my own sense of what's right and what's wrong, I have to believe at some point, you know, the story of how bad these things are is going to come out and is going to cripple this voucher push. I tried to help start some of this with the book. I mean, it's almost uniformly, we don't get a lot of easy answers in social science. This case against vouchers, just from a data standpoint, is about as one-sided as social science gets. Now, sometimes I have to tell you, I mean, some days I get really depressed having this argument because I'm in a place right now publicly, and I go out in the world and I argue about this, or social media or whatever, or I write newspaper columns, and then there's a counterpoint and stuff like this. It's hard, it's exhausting to argue about data with people who, for example, think Donald Trump won the election in 2020. I mean, if that's your standard of evidence, it's going to be a long haul, isn't it? But I do think that, listen, as that case against these voucher schemes has accumulated from the standpoint of social science over the last decade, so too has the case for some of those things that I named when I was sort of reading that excerpt and some of the things that we've sort of raised quickly here today. It turns out that universal, so there's a lot of like, I've picked on right-wing theories today. Some of the things we know most about, I think, have long-term promise to replace the conversation again, not just because the data are there, but because increasingly they're both right and they're obvious. So just some of those examples again. It turns out that hungry children learn less well. It turns out that cold children in the winter and hot children in the summer learn less well. So investments in universal school meals, investing in new heating and cooling systems. It doesn't sound like an educational intervention, but it is. We just came out of a pandemic. It turns out that children who are struggling to breathe because maybe they're asthmatic or the room isn't properly ventilated don't learn as well. Investing in new ventilation systems. Investing in, my wife and I live not that far from Flint, Michigan, where this whole Friedman-style libertarian approach to deregulation helped poison an entire community. It turns out that drinking water, students who don't have access to clean water and to healthy food don't learn as well too, in addition to the fact that they're getting sick, right? So I think all of these things, I do hope all of these things need to come to some sort of a head. But we are accumulating more and more evidence about this, and that's what starts, like, as this case against vouchers is built, we are learning all of these things really help kids build an educational future for themselves. It starts with more and more investments in public schools. I mean, it really does. And sometimes, especially when I talk to kind of nationally based reporters, and I hope if anybody's in the room, I'm not picking on your profession, but sometimes I think people expect me to say something in an answer to this question like this about like to go hawk a new curriculum or hawk a new teacher training program or something. And all those things do matter a little bit, but it has to start with, like, you put your money where your mouth is. And it turns out that we have a study just in May was released by university researchers at Brown University, showing that investments in local public schools led to greater life expectancy for the children that were invested in 20 to 30 years later. So we're talking about like long-term investments here. I think those conversations, I guess I'll just close that answer by saying if we are to move past these things 20 years from now, we have to be having these kinds of conversations, these whole child approaches, these conversations about where to put money, not just because it works, but because it's the right thing to do. And I think if we do that, then I do think that this movement will recede eventually. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. I don't know if this is like way off, but I don't even know how to formulate this question. Would you say there's been any kind of like failure on the Democratic side of messaging that, like, bigger picture, elementary to higher education, schools are so much more than just like a job pipeline and an extension of the marketplace, and so we need to think of them as more than that? Sorry, I'm shaking. I hate talking in front of people.
No, thank you for that question. I think the answer is yes. I think there has been a failure of messaging, and I'll kind of say I think part of it is, listen, I don't know that I want to acknowledge and affirm that schools of any sort are absolutely more than a job pipeline. But I also want to kind of acknowledge and affirm that sometimes that top of line, parents do have a diverse set of reasons for what they want their children's education to look like and why they want them to be educated in the first place. The Betsy DeVosses of the world will say it's to advance God's kingdom on earth. Others would say, I just want my child to be safer and wealthier, or at least have a little bit more comfort in life than I did. And that might be an economic argument. I think where Democrats have failed on this, and this has kind of been, if I have any kind of coherence here today, one of these themes that I keep trying to bring up is, I do think at some point they need to talk about investments in public schools because we're investing in children. And I don't just mean dollar amount, but making human investments in children, number one. And also not shying away from a conversation about what's right and what's wrong. You don't have to call out everybody's lifestyle or everybody's faith tradition or everybody's marital status or everybody's way of raising their children, but just some basic stuff. I mean, from everything from, we shouldn't have a coup on January 6th, to it isn't okay that we have one of the highest rates of child poverty and child malnutrition in the so-called developed world. Or it isn't okay that 3 days after 6 right-wing justices expanded the rights of private schools in this country in a hot day in June 2022, the Supreme Court ruled in Carson v. Macon that vouchers could be used not just for religious schools to educate, but for religious education in those schools specifically. That was just 2 years ago, and then 3 days after that, those same 6 right-wing justices rolled back 50 years of reproductive rights for half the people in this country. All of these things are kind of happening at once, and I think we get more comfortable talking about some areas outside the education sphere, correctly so, in terms of what's right and what's wrong. And I think there needs to be a little bit more leaning into that in the education space on the left, or among progressives anyway, in talking about some of these programs. It's not just that universal meals work. It's the right thing to do. It's not just that investing in heating and cooling system updates in public schools works. It's the right thing to do. I don't know if that solves everything, but I think being able to have these conversations makes it easier to assure folks that you're speaking with that you at least are trying to be, you're on their side, you want what's best for their children, even if you don't know exactly what it is because you're not their parent. We're all trying to end this together. And I think more of that language does need to be brought into the conversation and not strictly talking about it in terms of, say, for an additional year of schooling, you might earn an extra $1,000 a year. I don't want to discount all of those things, but I do think having some basic understanding and commitment to kind of why we want public schools as parts of community, parts ultimately of a democracy, I think we need to kind of have more of those conversations for sure.
You have to stop letting them control the narrative.
That's another way to put it too. I think we have time for one more.
Yeah, I was going to say one more question. Is there anybody that I missed who's been asking a lot?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
So I'm kind of like her in the sense of this may be an out there comment or question. And I want to go back to the motivation issue that you raised. You've mentioned several motivations for the backers of this movement, this voucher movement. Certainly, lack of regulation or hatred of regulation could be one motivation. Religious, I want to promote my particular way of thinking about God and all that stuff is another motivation. A third motivation could be a race-based motivation that I want my kids to be segregated from kids that don't look like my kids. And of course, underlying all of this is an economic motivation that you're going to suck money out of the public schools and use it to fund schools that do more of what I want to do. Okay, that's the basic kind of a motivation theme that is emerging from at least what I took away. But I have read, and I can't quite remember the source, if there is a deeper, more sinister, if you will, economic motivation for this. And that is the creation of an economic underclass that is not as well educated, that does not have the capacity to think for themselves, that are in some sense fodder for people to prey on, for the more wealthy, for the more powerful. And this sounds very like a conspiracy theory that, this is the, but
I think,
it's hard not to run away from a conclusion like that. I wonder if you have any comments on that.
I think, and as I say in the book, and even the excerpt that I read, it's at the end of the day, I can speak to the motivation of these groups and these organizations and networks that are pushing these things through. Obviously, speaking to the motivation of some of these individual people, who knows? But I will say this, from Betsy DeVos on, her whole family, folks have talked about this notion of a gospel of wealth, or a wealth gospel. If you've sort of read your Calvinism, the idea, if you're wealthy, it's probably because you deserved it, is basically what it comes down to. And you're going to live in such a way that you're not necessarily pulling up the drawbridge behind you, but you're going to have a drawbridge for sure, just in case. So there is some of this. I would call it, so the voucher as a policy implementation in states like Iowa today, what I do know is this, that it is built and run out of decided indifference to the plight of other human beings and to their long-term chances in life, at least those who aren't in your church community or who don't practice the way you do or who don't, again, have a family structure the way you do and so on and so forth, or perhaps aren't in your income class. I think there is some general sense that maybe through good fortune, maybe moral character as they see it, maybe through the market, if the market is God in their view, then maybe providing vouchers will let some kids rise through and break through what they see as class barriers. And if not, may God's will be done is sort of how it's viewed. And I think it comes down to kind of indifference to the outcome as long as it's helping. And then I would stop short. Like, I don't know beyond that, but I do know that it's indifference to poverty. I do know it's indifference to social justice. I do know that it's indifference to historical marginalization, because that is the theory of action behind these voucher schemes. That's what it is. Listen, I really, really appreciate all these questions. I'll be out there signing if you want. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Yes, there will be